Welcome back to Side Quest 9, Final Fantasy 9, Episode 6. Back with me, my perennial partner in crime and consummate companion. I guess my perennial party member, Wes Schantz. Good to see you, Wes.
It's good to see you too. Bright and early. How's it going?
Yes, very different from the place that we are going to consider, the land of eternal rain, Burmecia, and a land of a sort of anthropomorphic rat type person, the Burmecians. And so one of the few races that we've now seen. We've seen these black mages, which maybe are human, maybe not. Looks like they're manufactured. They're not human, though Vivi himself questions, "Am I not even human?" Even though he was raised by a coup. And Quina says, "Well, I'm not human, so what's it even matter?" And individuals like Queen Brun who are human. So, for one's moral valency, does one need to be human to have, ethical parameters applied to one or to live a good life in this world, particularly? The answer doesn't seem like yes. But this has been a very interesting playthrough. But in the pre-show, we were talking about some slightly meta commentary on the playing of games, just because of how I've had to play the game recently and how you also play the game. And this goes all the way back to Final Fantasy VII, actually. I had to, because I spent many years away from video games, buy a PlayStation 3, which was already 10 years old prior to us first playing and podcasting on Final Fantasy VII back in 2018.
Ooh,
Since then, I have purchased a PS4 and then even recently a PS5 and also a Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch and the PS4 I bought during COVID, thinking that I would have some extra time. So when I played Final Fantasy VII, it was a port. It was very much like I thought the conventional Final Fantasy VII with very little change. But starting with Final Fantasy VIII, I started to get a little bit farther away from the original experience. Something in the and so I was playing the remaster, and I thought it was very well remastered, and many face shots of Squall in the mise en scène or in the normal narrative, not in CGI. I got to see his face, and I got to see Renoa's and Idea's, and that I thought did improve the experience a little bit. But there were quality of life improvements that I had access to that I tried not to use. One of them, I think, made you invincible. One of them made you so that you could do like massive damage. I think one of them made it so that no enemies would pop up. Luckily, Diablos had already taken care of that for me. And one of them sped up the game to like 3 or 4 times speed. That's one
mhm.
I did sometimes use, and especially when I didn't have random encounters in on various maps. And I thought that wasn't so big of a change, and that really helped for the podcasting. But now we find ourselves, or rather, I find myself playing a ported version of Final Fantasy IX on Switch. And because of our friends over at Final Fantasy Union, we know that this port is actually pretty low quality. Even though I'm on a next gen console, the Switch, which is now it and the PS4 for whom this port was first made, or I guess like not the most next gen consoles with PS5 and Switch 2 out. But the port itself, we learned, came from an iOS mobile version, and much later than that version, and didn't seem to have since it used a different engine, I think the Union engine to make it, so a new engine entirely to make the game.
Mhm, mhm.
There were some problems with load times, and that is something that we have actually talked about in our various pre-shows. That sometimes I don't know whether the game has frozen when switching between a map or a world map or a stage map to the battle map. It can take many, many, many seconds, 3 or 4 times longer than the PS1. And also, the game is frozen on a couple times. So even though there are quality of life improvements, again, I think there is the fast battle mode, the 9,000, you can do 9,999 damage, which is the damage cap in Final Fantasy 9. And also I think you can have like full health when you fight. I've only accidentally done that once when I paused, and from the pause menu is where you can manipulate the game in that way. And so I did that by accident. So I'm not trying to change the nature of the game, but something we sort of touched on in the pre-show is that a port is a version of a video game adaptation, actually in scholarly literature. And you are not playing ports. You are playing on the original PlayStation, now called the PS1. And we thought we might mention that just a little bit because that is part of the experience and part of the difference in the experience
Totally.
of our planes and of our our new experiences of the game.
Well, yeah, like we were talking about last time, I think like we bring a lot to these games that help us or change how we interpret them. But also the game itself is changing over time, and the ways that people can access it are always changing. And I'll say that my preferred way to play these old games is honestly as mods on the DS, the 2DS that I have, that my friend Steve sent me, and he had uh, unlocked it and set it up to play all kinds of cool stuff. So I can play like the original Mother 2 in Japanese on there. And for a while, that was my big project was like, I'm going to learn Japanese by playing the original Earthbound. I didn't get very far with that, but it's still an aspirational thing. Anyway, but all the Dragon Quest games that were not originally released here, and a bunch of Pokemon games, and all kinds of fun stuff. And the great thing about that is it's handheld, it's portable, it's very easy to turn on, turn off, and by and large, the load times are not that bad. So people who mod these things are players first, and they're not concerned with selling a bunch of copies right away. They have the time to go in and fiddle with stuff and make it, yeah, a good user experience and an authentic one as much as possible. And then you can also do things that radically change the game to make it easier, to make it harder, to just make it different in all sorts of ways. And I love the story of the creator of Undertale and Deltarune now, Toby Fox. He sort of got his, you know, his start practicing making games through making mods of Earthbound. And you can really tell, actually, in some of his work that that's a huge formative experience for him. You know, he talks about learning to read, like actually reading the text of the game, but in another sense, he's also learning to create games and to write games by playing with the source code there. And it's a huge communal experience, right? It's not necessarily something one person is going to figure out, but with the power of the internet and message boards from back in the day, people discover things, they share things, they put it up there, and, arguably this is all crime and criminal activity. But these are people who've already purchased the game in most cases, have given tons of money over the years to these companies. And for the most part, the companies are not aggressively trying to stamp this out, although very few are actively promoting it in any way. And so, with a game like Final Fantasy IX, you know, hugely successful already, uh, although maybe not as successful as they would have hoped. Um, and so everything on top of that is kind of gravy for them, right? If they can make some new versions of it that they can sell again, then why wouldn't they do that? They're not going to take the time, they're not going to take the care and invest the money to make those perfect versions of the game, at least not at this stage. And I still continue to hope and to harp on the need for somebody to come out and be the Criterion collection of video games, to make the sort of the definitive version of a game that is in some way uniform across a collection or an anthology, and that would allow for a true, productive, scholarly kind of a body of work to form around it without having to go into all these caveats and, well, but this is this version and this is that version. And that's a whole kind of side discussion, I feel like, which is where we are, and that's okay. But I think that we could see in the future attempts to get towards, scholarly editions in the way that you have a scholarly edition of Chaucer or Shakespeare, right, with all sort of helpful things that are in there and attempts to correct the text and get it as close as possible to the the best or the ideal form of that. Um, Now there's also the difficulties of playing on old systems where they are hard to find. The games are very expensive in some cases, but that is as close as we have right now to like the authentic experience, I guess. Um, the bad thing about it is you can't carry it with you. So, if I'm going to play this game, I have to carve out some time. I have to carve out the space. I have to, make my best effort to remember everything that happens because I can't easily take screenshots. Um, Now, what I've been doing is just looking at the Let's Play archive, which has like pretty much a shot for shot, archive of the game, but it's not my playthrough, you know. And so there's things that are kind of mixed up or things that are additional, things that I didn't find and stuff like that. So all that to say, we appreciate the efforts of all those kind of anonymous people for the most part who've done all the work to make these games accessible to more people for more time as much as possible. And we acknowledge that there is in some sense a an authentic and a legal version of playing this, which is important to bear in mind as well. And that too might be changing over time. That the companies, for now at least, have the power, if they have the will, to make that the better and the more accessible version of these games. Um, yeah, and to actually fix the bugs that all of us are finding as we play them. Wouldn't that be nice?
I think it would. I think you touched on several interesting things like the modding community and the sort of non-canonical or apocryphal changes
Mhm.
that they make to games and how it's interesting that this has been, in my experience, part of many major games. Like, for example, if one were a player of Magic cards, back in the day, as it were, although Magic cards are still played these days, there were standard tournament rules that people could play, but then there were also sort of modified rules like all mana down or playing with
Oh
larger
yeah.
decks than the 60 card standard, which would often have, as for a standard competition or tournament player, 20 pieces of land. And generally, only one color was going to work best in a competition setting. But with all mana down, you could maybe mix two colors, green and white, and there are some nasty enchantments on people, and there were also different sorts of decks you could have, like interruption decks with playing blue. They were just really made to annoy the person you were playing against, rather than to just overpower them, like if you played black or red, which I
Yeah.
really liked to do. I had a goblin deck as well as a black deck where I could just like basically I had all these cards that could siphon life points from people. But I mean, I think there's a much larger discussion. I mean, we could write a book on this, and perhaps we will at some point. But
Hmm.
what is the relationship between the fan community and the work of art itself? Especially when it comes to a video game. A video game is not simply a work of art, but something mass produced in order to make money and often millions of dollars. And there is a difference between, say, independent video game companies like the one producing Dante's Divine Comedy in Italy, coming out 2026, and
Ooh.
a massive or a fairly massive company like Square or Square Enix. But then the sort of two questions become sort of interesting and prominent in one's mind. Where does the relationship between author and patient, or author and recipient, or player, um, where is that line? Because on the one hand, in an RPG, one can choose how one plays. But on the other hand, in a modding situation, players are then creating adjustments to the game that go outside of the game, but then become part of the game and then become part of their experiences and other player experiences, thus making for even more apocryphal experiences. So even if within a game itself, with multiple endings, like say a Chrono Trigger, for example, and even within Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, depending on which characters are in your party and which side quests you participate on, you might get a more or less canonical experience of the game. We talked about this a lot with Final Fantasy 8, where it's really easy to miss all of the extremely rich mythology, and you did a really great job of tracking it down, unlike me, because we have such different play styles. But once mods are added in, I think the question becomes much trickier, because sometimes mods are really good and really add to the experience. And some of them seem to have been, or things that modders traditionally did, even through Game Shark, seem to have now been added in to remastered or ported versions, and suggesting that some of the fans made into non-canonical authors, actually their apocryphal ideas have then made it into the new canon, as it were. So just to touch on two or three things you said immediately, the idea of an authoritative Criterion edition. This is fantastic. This is, I think, absolutely necessary. especially with and I wonder what you think of Ultimania editions
Mm,
coming out, books that accompany these games, and then try and set things straight. But I think there are limitations to a book describing what a video game is supposed to be. In the same way that a scholarship might is going to miss the phenomenology of playing a game, though it might elucidate or illuminate elements within the game that one absorbed without noticing. Um, but and so, but my other, again, I think this is a bigger question that maybe we can answer now, maybe not, is what then are the criteria that game developers have for porting a game, remastering a game, and remaking a game? And I know we've avoided that a little bit by not getting into Final Fantasy VII's remake, and then the Intergrade, which actually fixed some of the issues with the remake, and then the Rebirth adaptation. But are they aesthetic reasons? Like they really wanted to tell the story better? Is it because the fans have really pushed? And what does it mean by fans pushing? Do they go to events? Are there huge online spaces? Is there a critical number of like mods, or is there a critical number of purchases of ports, or is there a critical number of like illegal downloads of
right.
ports, right? I mean that's something I would pay attention to too. If there's a huge black market for my games with a slight difference, I would want to create a white market that had those same modifications so that people could either easier access or pay me for what is mostly mine with an innovation that somebody else came up with. Um, but so are there economic or what determines that Final Fantasy VIII is remastered? What determines that Final Fantasy IX is just ported? What
Mhm,
determines that Final Fantasy VII has a remake? And the remake is not even necessarily a remake so much as a full-scale readaptation and retelling.
mhm, mhm.
So it may even go beyond what we consider a remake. So I just wanted to put that all together to say that I think that what a game is, or the essence of it, seems to be somewhat organic, living,
Totally.
developing. That the fan community is part of it, that they have an authorial aspect to them in terms of what they purchase and in terms of what they change in an apocryphal way, because that can lead to apocryphal changes over over time. And then again, what is the difference, or what is the criterion for porting, remastering, remaking? And we see these debates in the fan community. Obviously, Final Fantasy VII fans are so happy that their game is being remade, though many are upset at the fact that it's a much less faithful adaptation than they would have expected. Final Fantasy VIII was remastered. People are happy about that, but not as happy as a remake. And then Final Fantasy IX is sort of left out in the loop. They have this port, but no remaster and no remake. And we are at the 25-year anniversary,
Yeah.
and it seemed to get sort of short shrift, especially as fans are waiting for the incoming incumbent announcement about the third installment of the Final Fantasy VII remake.
Those are really good questions for CEOs to have to ponder, right? This is above my pay grade. And I mean they have limited resources, right? I mean, even a huge company with all these successes under its belt, every new game that they put out is really kind of putting their company on the line. Like they put so much time, effort, money,
And we
they
know
outlay all of that.
because of their failed movie that you brought up. This ruined the company. They had to merge with
Yeah.
Square with Enix after that. So yeah, no, I mean yeah, sorry, not to interrupt you, but you were totally right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that the most important factor has to be the commercial.
Mm.
And if they can see a way to squeeze more money out of a thing by putting less effort into it, right? Even if the game's going to crash and it's a little bit subpar, and even if it's disappointing, the really, really diehard FF9 fans that they didn't even really add much to it, right? Much less do a creative retelling the way FF7 got. So what, right? I mean, they're still going to buy the game. So the the other kind of thing that this makes me think about is the balance between gameplay and story,
Mm.
right? Because even as they're crafting the game itself, there are similarly these limitations on the hardware, on the time, on the money they can invest. and in some ways on the player's attention span, right? So um, the Final Fantasy games tend to lean pretty hard into story as you know as games go, um, but as RPGs go, they've always been characterized just as much, if not more, by the sort of more immediately aesthetic qualities of the experience, the visuals, the music, and the ways that they innovate and change the gameplay from game to game. They're not continually just doing the same thing. They're always adding, remixing, reimagining. Um, and so the series as a whole kind of encapsulates this very process of asking these kinds of questions. And with very few exceptions, especially early on, um, there were no like direct sequels, so the story had to be sort of self-contained. It wasn't going to get, added to or retconned in some way, changed up with the following game. Um, Now, again, as we get later into the series, that becomes a little squishier. Um, but I think, at this point in the playthrough, where I don't know, 7 hours in or so, we've kind of come through two major story arcs so far. And as we exit Lindblum, we're into this new character, Freya, and her whole thing, and her land being under siege from the Black Mages. And um, it's a chance to sort of take a fresh look at what's going on under the hood of this game, kind of, right? Um, and this is where the Resonant Arc fellas also take a little bit of time out to just like look at the gameplay and what's working, what's not working, and stuff like that. And this is primarily triggered, I think, because A, we have a new area to explore, and it includes some new characters, at least one that you have to get at this point, and one that's optional, although really hard to miss
Yes.
at this point. And and it has this like major mini game that's introduced of the Chocobo side quest, which is a little harder to find, but there's people who kind of tell you about that, and you can see it as you're looking through the telescope up there with Garnet. And so, again, like if you're playing this game and you're still playing at this point, 7 hours in, you're probably going to go over to that forest and see what's going on with the chocobos. So all those are sort of elements here that I'd be interested to dig into a little bit and think about kind of what they're adding to the experience. I know Quina is a fan favorite um, and one of our favorite characters, and so maybe we start there because like as you leave the town, if you just kind of go straight, you run into the marsh, the marsh of the Q tribe, and we've actually seen it before. It's the place where the Mog brothers are hanging out, and so the music is familiar, and you sure enough you run into them right away. Um, in other games, those are playable characters, the Mogs, the Mughals rather. In this game, not. They're just sort of tutorial and they're the save function and stuff like that. Um, but they are not the main attraction here. You can sort of go through, in a weird way, you're like going through the backdrop, right? Because you go into this like dense, reedy marsh, and then you come out the other side, and it's this kind of strange creature. I think we've seen one of them actually back in the castle. The Cook of Alexandria is one of these Q tribe, but this person is like a weird little bonnet and some creepy like star-looking eyes and this huge red tongue. Um, is obsessed with frogs and with eating, and so by catching a frog, you unlock this playable character, and they set off on a quest, which is sort of tangential to your quest to like eat as many foods as possible and become a gourmand. Um, yeah, yeah. So impressions of Kina and any other gameplay things that are jumping out at you right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so several of them. So we had this foreshadowing in the Castle of Alexandria with Aku as the royal cook, who I'd mistaken for Quina, or Kina, when depending on whether we're doing Spanish or Italian pronunciation, ka or qua with the key QU, and this is an in-game language, so who
Right.
knows? But and they don't have voice acting yet in Final Fantasy 9. That comes about in Final Fantasy 10. And so just visually, he looks like a Lickitung from Pokemon. He's pink, and I just said sort of creepy eyes, which I believe don't have pupils in them, and so he has sort of like a dog-like expression, in that like his face is sort of always the same expression, similar to Vivi in some ways.
Hmm.
I would also just sort of connect this to the fact that we seem to have several different races available to our team, which is now, I think, split into two. We have this sort of black mage. We're not sure if that's a different race or not yet, but it seems so given what we've just experienced in Dali, seeing them manufactured from this. We have these rat appearing individuals from Burmecia, who dress very dapperly, like Freya. And now we have this coup. And this is one of the more outlandish, sort of cartoonish looking creatures, one might say. It almost, you could almost imagine Quina being in the second circle or the third circle of Dante's Inferno among the gluttonous.
Hmm.
Because he has such a huge tongue and always wants to stop and eat frogs. There may be a touch of French influence on his design. Being a gourmand and liking frogs, and right, and but also I want to contrast him a little bit with the sort of lugubrious, and maybe I should really use this word in a technical way, the lugubrious nature of Freya. Freya Freya
Hmm.
is very serious and is dressed as a knight and is pursuing her lost love. So again, with fairy tale sort of mythological motifs. She reminds me of Halcyone, who was, or from whom we get Halcyon who's an ancient Greek figure who stayed on a cliff and waited for her husband to return, but he never did. And then eventually she jumps off the cliff because of that. Freya is this sort of not stilted or jilted, not a jilted lover, but someone who is waiting for
Hmm.
someone who very well may be a ghostly lover,
Yeah.
like a Penelope, but she's not waiting. She's looking for him because she too is a dragoon, like he is. And so, just not to immediately move to her, but to contextualize my connection with Quina, is that two interesting things about Freya and Fratley is that Freya inverts the sort of gendered relationship between Odysseus and Penelope, and that she is actively searching for her love, like Telemachus does for Odysseus, rather than waiting for him. The second thing is that is that the person that she loves, we find out in Burmecia, is amnesiac and has forgotten her. So just there,
Hmm.
add that to another fairy tale motif, an amnesiac individual. But what's interesting about this to me is that, and I call her lugubrious technically because not only is she sad, but she comes from a land of rain. And so
Hmm.
the idea of lugubrious is to be tearful. Um, is that she's so serious, and she's pursuing this character that is almost like a Sephiroth. Not nearly as powerful as Sephiroth within the game. And I would say the same as Beatrice too. Beatrice has killed 100 soldiers before, and it's a lot like a Sephiroth. And Kuja looks a lot like a Sephiroth, and it seems to be occupying the actual role of Sephiroth. But
Yeah.
it's almost like Freya is another protagonist, and that she's got her own hero's journey that's already going on. And she is more of a traditional hero than Zidane, seemingly. She is a
Yeah.
knight. She serves a kingdom. But importantly, and for the hero's journey, she seems to have turned away from the kingdom. She left her kingdom 5 years ago for personal, selfish reasons to pursue Fratley, apparently. But now, when they get back to Burmecia, she feels a tug of responsibility. So not only has she sort of been doggedly pursuing Fratley, but she's also felt some, or at least feels when returning to Burmecia, that she needs to return to her duty, that her duty calls to her, as it were, that she has a responsibility to fight for her people. And so in some ways strikes me as an exemplar for both Zidane and for Dagger, even though Dagger's not in the party at this point. So I just say all of that to say that Freya seems like this individual who has to deal with very deep, difficult emotions: love lost,
Hmm.
fighting for one's kingdom, trying to defend one's king under threat, experiencing finding one's love, and that love not remembering once, like Tifa and Cloud down in Coral Medial, was it called, where
Hmm.
where he falls into the life stream. And and then there's Quina. who is totally carefree. And this is actually mentioned. Freya doesn't refer to Quina as they, but as S/he. So,
Yeah.
which is the old way of saying, I don't know which. But that Freya says maybe I should take some notes from Quina because Queen is just always living in the moment, always pursuing a particular goal and doesn't seem to be upset, but just sort of excited. And so with these two new characters, I think we see at different poles of existence and different ways of existing in the world, in this world that is such a strange world, this Gaia, as it were. I don't think we've heard it named yet in relation to Terra, though we will. Um, but so that's what I'd like to mention. I guess I would also say that Quina seems to be clearly like comic relief in the tradition of Japanese role-playing games and animes that that Final Fantasies tend to be extremely heavy and including death and murder and suicide and destruction. And, Cyan's children were and wife were poisoned by Kefka in Final Fantasy VI. In Final
Mhm.
Fantasy VII, Aerith is, spoiler alert, is killed. Final Fantasy VIII deals with bodily autonomy and losing one's own will and being forced to do terrible things. Same thing as Final Fantasy VII and other instances as well. That's part of Sephiroth's power. Um, Being able to manipulate people to do what they want. Also, that's part of Ultimatia's power. But then you get Quina, who just cares about food. And so are we being shown differing modalities of existence that are valid, Wes? Like all of these people are just, sort of like parts of the colors of a visual spectrum, and that they're all sort of necessary or not necessary, but pragmatic or effective ways of living in a world, in a swamp, focusing on food under a master, and then going out to it, or being created and then taken care of by a different race, or not even knowing who you are, like Zidane, or being a princess and not knowing who you are, like Dagger, or coming from a rainy kingdom like Burmecia. It is the difference between these characters supposed to highlight different ways of living in this world and perhaps different models of existence, or are we supposed to take differing aspects of them in order to form our character as sort of a meta Bildungsroman as the players of this game?
I mean, I think it's mostly a use of kind of a palette of emotions and you know experiences that the directors, the team, the creative team wants to share with the audience, right? And so yeah, the characters are a primary way of accessing those different kind of feels, and it seems pretty common that there's a kind of comic relief character that's included in these games. Um, or like a mascot character almost.
Yeah, like Kate
And
or
who?
like Kate Sith in Final Fantasy VII.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm thinking again, yeah, of Xenogears like usual, and there's this like living doll that's like a bunny. And so it joins your party because why not? Yeah, it's a thing. And I think Pokemon is a very accurate referent here as well, tapping into that kind of aesthetic and that kind of gameplay even because the way that you learn blue magic spells in this game is not by getting struck with them or by using items, but rather by eating the enemy in question. And so, to eat the enemy, like in Pokemon, to catch the Pokemon, you have to lower its health a certain amount, and it's a fixed amount in this game. It's to a quarter of its health,
Hmm.
unless Quina is in her trance, in which case they they can gobble it up when it's only at half health. And so this is a place where guides come in really handy because some of these spells are really useful, but they're kind of out of the way to find the enemy and to get it to the right amount of health and to survive the battle in the first place, right? And so there's some ways that you can break the game pretty quickly here once Quina joins the party if you know what you're up to. And there's some other ways in which, yeah, the themes of the game clearly revolve around a pretty clear dichotomy between uh, you know, the life impulse and joy to vive and all that stuff, and then the the heaviness, the death, the inevitable question of, um, you know, am I truly human at all? You know, this kind of despair almost, much less just mortality. And so that's on small scales, that's on large scales. And Quina is pretty far on the spectrum of like the joy, right? It's just like I'm out there, I'm eating stuff, it's great. I think you're actually right that canonically this is the coup who is the cook back in Alexandria.
Hmm.
And and Vivi is an interesting case here because Vivi points out that his grandpa looks exactly like Quale, the elder coup, that is sending Quina on this quest. And when he says this, Qual is like, "Yeah, I don't know that guy. Like he's terrible, and I don't know him." Right? So there's some kind of maybe an exile or falling out of, at least that happened there. So there's like a little seed planted there. But the main contrast seems to be, yeah, with Freya, this other character we just met who has this very dark backstory. And so when you have both of those things happening, there's a kind of incoherence possible there. Like it might just turn players off because like how can both these things be believable, compelling at the same time? And that's the case with lots of things about these games because they are so disparate. You're doing all this like very deep stuff, and yet you're essentially watching a cartoon, or a puppet show or whatever. So there's that like basic disconnect. But on the other hand, there's something delightful about just throwing stuff into the game and all of these, global mythologies and yeah, these names from previous Final Fantasies and allusions to other games that aren't even in the series, right? And just seeing how that can gel together into a still pretty fun experience and one that might even be meaningful for players and certainly is for some players. And so that's the tack I tend to take with it is like they are trying to have as many things fit into the limited space and time of this game as they can. And this is a way that they're doing it is through the characters that are introduced kind of back to back here. Um, the the fact that we also, throughout this game have been jumping perspectives
Hmm.
is another kind of example of that, right? And as you point out, we're kind of in two parties right now, and we're going to keep jumping back and forth between the two for quite a while until they finally reunite. Um, and we get to explore, right? And so, why are we exploring? I mean, in terms of the actual story, we really shouldn't be. We should be going as fast as we can to catch up with the princess, right? That's what we want uh, in Zidane mind. Um, we are trying to get to the kingdom of Burmecia, and we're trying to rescue the king, right, and save the kingdom. That's in Freya mind. That's what we should want to do. And yet, it's very clear that what the developers are suggesting that we do is really more like Quina, right? It's just like go out there and eat as many things as you can and explore to to your heart's content. And there is no in-game timer or anything. There's no consequence. There's a secret item that you can only get if you play really fast.
Yes.
It's a sword for Steiner, right? I have never even gotten close to getting that item because I'm way more interested in doing all the million, 10,000 other things that there are. So
Well,
yeah.
it's so interesting that just at the very end of what you said there, because I want to touch on the dynamic of the two teams, which is something that we saw in Final Fantasy VIII for a little while, right at the beginning of Disc 2, when we were in the D District prison, and then had to have Irvine and Renoa come back for us, and then everybody gets split up at the end of that. Right, and then we
Yep.
have to re-meet them again at Fisherman's Horizon, FH.
Mhm.
Um, but it is interesting that you mention the contrast between the narrative of the game itself and how it encourages you to move fast. And in fact, there is one item, the ultimate sword item of Steiner, that requires that you like get to near the end of the game in 12 hours, which is almost impossible, and does seem to suggest that you play the game so that you miss almost everything in it. But this is something you brought up in Final Fantasy VIII, how and we talked about, I thought, quite a bit near the end, as the narrative pace, especially from the beginning of disc 3 all the way to disc 4, really speeds up.
Mhm.
Getting to the lunatic Pandora, going out to the Ragnarok, facing Adele. It's very easy to all of a sudden be at the end of the game because you're doing the things that the game suggests that you need to do. But you very diligently did an excellent job of also recognizing that uh, not from a narratological point of view, but a ludological point. There we go.
There we go.
Add an extra syllable there when you make something into a word into an adjective. It makes it tough. Like infinite and finite, or even pronunciations change. But that was also the time, if you could avoid the gravity of the narrative pulling you forward, the side-scrolling nature of it, you could really explore the world. And you're experiencing the same thing now in Final Fantasy IX, that now we have a moment to explore, though the narrative pace is picking up. And so you have to, again, fight yourself as a person to, do I want to just move the story forward? Or do I want to understand the world in which I am living in, or playing right now? And those are two different inclinations to enjoy and learn and get everything there is from the cornucopia of the game, which, as you've mentioned, Final Fantasy does a great job of being a cornucopia. And you never know what's going to be in the Horn of Plenty whenever you look in there. It's sometimes some of the same fruit, but often a lot of different fruit too. And sometimes it looks a little different, but it tastes the same, right? But so that's the thing. Like you said, it's a pastiche not only of world mythology and of other stories, but of itself and its early iterations as it continues to sort of, like a snake, slough off its former skin and then take on a new one. But like one of Dante's snakes in Inferno 24 and 25, it like will change into different seeming creatures as well, not just the same old snake, as it were. And so I think that is a really interesting thing to have to confront in a game, because one confronts it in life too. When does one need to stop and smell the flowers, which I think doesn't mean just relax, but means look around,
Hmm.
take account of what's happening, maybe see the significance of it so that you can enjoy it. Because if you don't see the significance of it, you might miss the chance to really experience what is around you in a given moment, while also, of course, having to confront the fact we are we're pretty young professionals, that we still have to develop our families. We still have to develop our careers. And we want to. It's not simply that we have to, that, I'm trying to start a family and I'm trying to move from doctoral fellow to professor. And we both have lots of intellectual projects that we work on together. We're always moving forward.
Yeah.
Then again, you have young children. And I know that something that you are almost surely keen on and are reminded of by people the generation beyond you is, don't wish your time away. Even though it's tough, like they're not going to be kids again. And so even when it's hard, know that you don't get this time back. So
That's
you
what everyone says. Yeah. Enjoy
right.
it. Yeah.
Right. And I think Final Fantasy IX is doing a good job of also saying, well, once you finish this game, it's over. This is something you brought up with Final Fantasy VIII. You don't, yeah, you can replay it, but you might not get the chance to. This is the chance that you currently have without argumentation. So what are you going to do with it? And in some ways, then the game helps to be how one plays the game helps it is a model of how one lives one's life. And we talked about this a lot with Final Fantasy VII and our different methods of playing Final Fantasy VIII. I think Final Fantasy IX, of course, that's coming through as well. But I wanted to mention something that you brought up that we talked about last time, the active time events. And I had forgotten the term for this, but the term in literary studies that is applied to Ulysses, for example, of differing events happening within the same narrative at the same time, but being represented in differing chapters. So, like, you have to represent horizontally things that happen simultaneously in literature.
Mhm.
It's called spatial form. And so in Final Fantasy IX, we get a lot of spatial form. Dagger and Steiner are going in a different direction, and involved in differing relations with each other, going on these, trying to make it back to Alexandria and the city of nobles prior. And then they even end up hooking up with one of Zidane's crew. But then Zidane is off helping Freya at Burmecia and at this other kingdom, this third kingdom that we're going to meet. And so we've talked a little bit about having a four-person party and having classes that our characters are sort of sectioned into. And And we talked about a little bit, well, playing with three characters when you could have four, and going from three to four and four down to three really does add some interesting wrinkles into play. But what do you think about this gameplay mechanic that's really leaned into in this game, touched on in others, and in six, seven, and eight, but nine, seeing seeing your players when you don't have control of them seems to be a big aspect with the active time events. I was going to say engagements, but also playing with them, not with each other, but in differing combinations together seems to be a major aspect of this game. And I was wondering whether you thought that worked or didn't work, or what that brought to the table or left off the table using this notion of spatial form. Does it make it more literary experience? Does it make it more like our modern world with texting and being able to catch up with people, even though this was, before that world existed, right at the beginning of it in 2000? Or does it annoy you? It's to me, it's sort of annoying to, like, when I see an active time event, I'm like, "Ugh, I was gonna go do my thing, but yes, I'll watch."
Well, it is interesting that it gives you the option at least. Yeah. And so I think that it's intended to be more interactive that way, but a lot of them do end up being essentially kind of watching a cutscene rather than truly getting to do much or to add a lot of yeah, quality of experience there. It is a sort of like layering on of more without truly always integrating it into the main sort of through line of the story. And so there is a trade-off there. My own personal kind of preference is always for seeing more of what's there. And so I don't mind them. Um, I like the idea of spatial form because it's true that in all of these kinds of um, experiences, they're taking place in time, they're taking place on a kind of time arrow that's always moving forward. And in some ways, the game experience is a highly layered one because you have the visuals, the music, the story, the gameplay, all happening in a way simultaneously there. Um, but then there's also ways that you can kind of extend that even further. And I think Final Fantasy does a good job of exploring a lot of those ways. And so one of them is, yeah, knowing that things are happening off screen. And this takes that a step further where you can actually go and see what's happening off the main quest. And you can sometimes even interact with it in some way. Um, but another way is to add like depth uh, and a kind of like uh, almost microcosm element of what's happening. And so, the game changes from exploration to battle, and that's like one way that you sort of step into another space. And that's the main way that you sort of unlock progression in the game. Um, and so that it has its own form of space changing and like layering happening. But then you also get these mini games or these little moments that are in some way different from everything else going on. And so with Quina, it's the frog catching itself, but also the larger like eating up enemies instead of just defeating them in battle. And so learning spells that way. Um, and then there's um, the idea that like in some way you are not just exploring this world to find places, but now that you find the chocobo, you're exploring the world to find stuff. And so like when you go into the chocobo's forest, you again are kind of entering like a magical space, a game within the game, where the normal rules don't apply and different ones do. And you're running around digging frantically, trying to find exactly where the chocobo says the quest sound. That means there's something here. And when you dig down, maybe you can reach the item and maybe not. Maybe your beak isn't strong enough, so you got to level that up. And you get items, but you also get like clues to where other items are out in the world. And then you can run around on this chocobo, and it removes the battling because as long as you're riding the chocobo, you won't have random battles, which is great, but you won't get stronger. But you also can find these rare items, in some cases maybe unique items out there by digging in the world itself. And so this is, I mean, as you say that, you sort of hear like you're digging into what's there. Um, so there's a horizontal quality, but there's also like a depth quality that the game seems to be going for through these different gameplay innovations, maybe isn't the right word, but at least like again, yeah, trying out different things and seeing what works. And not everything is going to work for every player. And for some people, they'll get completely obsessed with like one or the other of these elements and try to just optimize it for whatever reason. I'll also say, like when you look in your items, you can go through the items and the abilities and you can read about them if you have the little helper Moogle activated. And so that's with the select button. And it'll say some stuff, especially with the key items. So at this point, we have quite a few of them. If you win, if any of the characters win the Master of the Hunt item, they get that. And it's about, again, like remembering your roots or something like that. And then when you go to the cave and you start opening the doors, the bell item says something really similar to what you're saying, which is it says, "Cherish this moment, for happiness is elusive," and that seems to be a major theme here of the the ways that these characters can or cannot access their um, their purpose, their joy, their meaning of life. And so for Freya, in some way she's trying to recapture something that's gone. She couldn't wait for him to come back, and so she's going out to seek him. For Quina, it's going out to seek food. Although they were perfectly happy kind of just eating the frogs, right? But they've been sent out and they've got to go. So they're like these kind of inverses of each other. For Zidane, it's, can he be a good, uh, you know, uh, can he just kind of focus on the one girl and stop trying to hit on all the girls? It's very similar to Sid, actually, right? Sid was hitting on maybe even the same girl. It's kind of unclear. The girl at the pub, um, and for each of the characters, there's something like this. And when you actually use the item, it shatters, right? So you have to find another one. You have to find another one. So there's like this quality of like to cherish the moment is to dissolve the moment. It is elusive. Enjoy it, but it's gone. And then are you going to keep seeking that same thing, or are you going to try to progress and actually get and build something that is going to endure? And that's the weird thing about Gizmaluke's Grotto is it's used for these essentially wedding ceremonies, right? So again, there's this romance theme going, and it's played for laughs because under the giant bell, the one that doesn't break is one of the Moogles that's been like trapped under it. And they jump out when they smell the kupu nut, and they have like super strength all of a sudden. So it's great, it's wonderful. But yeah, so yeah, to the question, I mean, of like, do I like the active elements, the jumping back and forth? Yes, I do. I'm okay with that.
So I think something that you touched on mentioning the bells. There's a moment in Burmecia where Vivi is asked by Freya whether he really wants to move forward because it may shatter his happiness, or that it may cause him tremendous pain. And he says that, no matter what, I have to go forward. And I think there's something really interesting there because, like you said, the item description of the bell, that happiness is elusive, is that it the game may be pushing us towards a notion, and you see this a little bit in Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, where Tifa is talking about how strong the characters had been 2 years ago when they had been, a team on their journey to fight Sephiroth, but that everything had changed so quickly. But then it seemed like they were reliving that glory. And maybe that at the end of the journey, like you mentioned with Final Fantasy VIII, the game is over.
Mhm.
It may be that the accomplishment of the thing that one wants does not make one happy. Like Ecclesiastes, that with much wisdom comes much suffering. And may be very much the case that the thing that Vivi wants, his modus, not his modus vivendi, but or operandi, but the thing that gives him motive force, the thing that motivates,
Mhm.
that once he attains it, he may be much less happy than he was while attempting to attain it. So while he is in a group with friends trying to discover the nature of his identity, might be the happiest moments of his life. And this may be something that he comes to understand once he attains what he's looking for. Once he understands the nature of his existence, well, A, will he really understand the nature of his existence by understanding what sort of creature he is? Or will he understand it, or will he understand what sort of creature he is, not understanding how he's manufactured and what the limitations of his temporal being are, but by the nature of the decisions he's made, like we've just talked about earlier.
Hmm.
There's an interesting young adult novel series, The Black Cauldron, with this character Taran.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the fourth installment of that series is called Taran the Wanderer, and he goes to look for his roots. And by the end of it, it's the whole notion is problematized that does it really matter where you came from? Does
Yeah.
that define who you are? And so each of these, many of these characters, as they find what they think they're looking for, become less happy. Steiner is confronted with these moral decisions, like choose between, his generalized responsibility to the kingdom or to a specific human dagger. And this is not an easy decision for him to make. Beatrix will run into this. Freya, when she sees Fratley, he doesn't even remember her. This is shockingly horrible and sad. Fortunately, he doesn't remember anything. It's not just her. That would have, I think, been way, way worse. Uh, Garnett, as she tries to understand the relationship between her and her mother and what's happening, this is not going to cause her much happiness either. And even characters that we're just now introduced to, like Kuja, when he comes to understand the nature of his being, when he's not even really looking for it, this will cause a vast rage in him. And so, like what you've been mentioning about digging in and exploring the game that is not simply horizontal, but also has a depth element, a going down into element, down into the game, but also possibly down into oneself. I think something the game is touching on, but that you are really putting a pin in, is that it it is showing us what the cliche that enjoy the journey tries to hip us to, which is that once you get what you wanted while you were trying to get what you wanted, you might not want it in the same way, or it might not be what you thought it was. And so the pursuit might be the best you get. There might not be anything better than the pursuit of what you want or what you think is your responsibility. And so, regardless of what your responsibility is or your desire, so there's a desire for Quina, there's a responsibility for Freya, there's sort of a personal responsibility, but a choice with Zidane. He chooses to help his friend, so he gets to be charitable, right? These are all different motivations. But what joins them all together is that they're with friends with with their own goals, but also a unified goal that they pursue themselves. And as living creatures who live in this horizontal arrow of time, but also can choose to dig in or just be blown along, maybe something that the game is suggesting to us is that having a shared ideal in common with others and pursuing that while also having your own ideals and maintaining and exploring your own individuality, maybe that's sort of a model for a good life in
Mhm.
in a finite existence that has a time element that only moves forward.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like there's not much more overarching themes than that we see throughout the whole series, right? Uh, and the way that these stories are told, with all the fantasy elements, with all the comic relief, with the maybe melodramatic or sentimental quality, like if you can sort of allow those all to be happening and yet still perceive what you're describing, um, I mean, I think that that's pretty close to the intent of the creators at that point, right? To be able to embrace all of those things. Um, Now they're also continually pushing their craft forward, right? They're not resting with the thing that they made last time that was good and sold a lot of copies or whatever. They're continually making the next thing, and tons of ideas don't quite get into the one that they're making at any given time and remain out there for people to grab onto to theorize about whatever. And I think particularly of like the design for these characters, because the way that the art, that goes onto the box looks is like so far from the art that's actually in the game in most of these cases. Um, Now with time that actually can kind of finally begin to merge. But that for me is exactly what you're talking about, right? Like sort of the inspiration or the vision that we can imagine as creative individuals or as a creative team is never quite captured in the thing that we produce. And there's always that distance as well, to bear in mind. And um, as players, we in some sense compensate for that with bringing our own imagination to the game. And that's truer with older games, and that's part of why I like the older games, that they have that sort of demand on the player to invest something to imbue these characters with the grandeur that's clearly supposed to be there in some sense, right? And that we want to be there. Um, so yeah, so all of these, explorations and things there for all of that, there is ultimately just the one path, and it's a very narrow path actually. And I know it's one that can be pretty difficult for a party that is not leveled up, or if you even just have some bad luck, actually. Because while, you can probably handle the black mages without too much trouble. And Zorn and Thorn, they're silly. They run away, so they're not attacking directly yet. They're they're scared of us because we, as they say, are savage monsters. We're destroying their black mages left and right. Um, the master of the grotto, Gizmaluk himself, is pretty serious contender for the hardest thing so far in this game. Like the boss at the end of the hunt, Zagnal the Beast, with the thunder magic and stuff, is optional ultimately. You don't have to fight that, and you don't have to win. You can lose, and maybe you should lose. Whereas this battle, you actually do have to win, but it might seem like it's an impossible fight if you're not ready, and if you get into a bad loop, because as his HP decreases, he starts to like, I think, just cast water spells like on the whole party, like faster and faster, and so you have to take him out pretty quickly at that point. So you better have a plan, or again, you better get kind of lucky and deal some heavy damage pretty quick. There's a couple tricks to this fight though. So one trick is to use a tent as an item in battle. It deals like randomly for some reason darkness, silence, maybe some other status effects on enemies. And so that's one thing that I read that you can do, because both darkness and silence work against him, and that's like his physical attacks and his magic attacks are basically a lot lower percentage of hitting. And then the other crazy thing you can do is allow Quina to be defeated and then revive them with a Phoenix down. And it's kind of random, but you can get them to come back with anywhere between 1 and 9 HP or something. And so if you get them to come back with 1 HP, or if you somehow let them survive with just 1 HP, that is the point at which they can use the Limit Glove blue magic, which you can learn from some enemy out there in the world. And so if you've learned that spell and they have 1 HP for some reason, then you can use Limit Glove and it deals 9999 every time. So so if Quina can pull off a Limit Glove, then you just win every battle. I mean, until I guess maybe there's some dragons up there on the plateau that will still kill you, but um, anything with less than 10,000 HP, you just one shot at that point. So I didn't do it against Gizmaluk, but I did use it against Beatrix because I was fortunate enough to get Quina back to life with 1 HP. And I was like, well, I could try to steal this like super rare item from Beatrix. Um, but after I stole like a couple things and Quina kept being alive and kept being alive, I'm like, kind of seems like I should just do this.
Yeah.
And so it was fantastic because it's an unwinnable battle. So even if you do that, I mean, you win the battle, but she deals this like, you know,
Calamity.
attack that drops everyone down to 1 HP, right? So it's this kind of tit for tat thing. And then she still stalks off saying, nobody can face me in a fair fight. I'll never find my match. And she has this super cool like battle music that's unique to her and all this. And she really outshines even Kuja, who's riding a freaking dragon, right? But somehow he's like way less cool than Beatrix and way less compelling as a character at this point.
Well,
So
she's got this like she's very real, right? Like there are a couple
yeah.
things that she says. She's like, "Why did I train so much?" And because this is something that's different between her and Sephiroth and Kefka to some and Celeste to some extent. Like Sephiroth, Celeste, and Kefka, when we meet them, are just great, amazing. In fact, Sephiroth is described, and this is an interesting way to describe him by Cloud Versus, any story that you've heard about Sephiroth's strength fails to capture just how powerful he is. So even that description itself adds to his ethos. And when he describes him, he takes, remember, 0 damage.
This
And
is the ineffability topos
yes, right,
in the Dante scholars' words. Yep, yep.
right. And but that is how strong Sephiroth is beyond
Yeah, yeah.
comprehension, beyond articulation, and he eventually proves it. Beatrix mentions that she's trained so hard so that she doesn't have to play second fiddle, and that
Mhm.
starts to annoy her. And this, I think, makes us connect to her as players because we realize that even though she has such exorbitant power, so beyond those around her, that she trained for it. It didn't just
Yeah.
happen, and that she wanted to be Beatrix. She wanted to be the top soldier and to be as capable as she is. But now she finds herself playing second fiddle to Kuja, and this makes her doubt what her role is and why she has become the person that she is. And so we don't have that same experience when we see Sephiroth. He does himself have to go through his own coming to Genova moment as it were, where he has to experience self-realization and his place within Shinra and how he's actually a tool. What he claims about Cloud is true of him early on, but I think Beatrix herself in a much less caustic way starts to realize that everybody is being used by Queen Braun slash Kuja, and that she's not that this is not what she signed up for. And so, as gifted a knight as she is, well, she wants to fight for a noble cause, a good cause. And so, similar to how Freya has been away from her responsibility and now is coming back to Burmecia to try and fulfill it, I think Beatrix, like Steiner, is coming to realize that life is not as simple as she and responsibility or duty are not as simple as she has conceptualized them. That actually she and Steiner cannot just give away the interpretive onus to their leader, but that they are going to have to interpret for themselves what is good and evil. And I think again that touches on something that all the Final Fantasies, but particularly 6, 7, 8, 9 do well, which is to problematize what is good and evil. Can
Mhm.
you just choose a side and be on the light side versus the dark side? It would seem no in this case, and particularly at this point in the game when Alexandria seems to be going bad, going on the offensive imperially, the Alexandrian queen seems to be under the influence of some individual who knows what he's after at this point. He rides a dragon. He's a very beautiful creature who I thought was female when I first played the game for many, many, many hours. And is very scantily clad and just is a beautiful character, though has perhaps an ugly soul, if in fact he has a soul. Um uh so yeah, so uh Beatrix is very interesting. I think Kuja, who is introduced here, is clearly interesting, riding on his silver dragon and whispering in Queen Braun's ear. We also recall that Dagger had said that he was lurking around, and things started to sort of change when she was talking to Sid about Braun and why she was acting the way, or what had led to her acting in the ways that she has been acting in this crazy imperialist way. And so we have these new. So not only do we have new characters in our party, but we're really introduced for the first time to Kuja and get to see Beatrix's great power on display. That the game even does not let us beat her. She is so powerful. Even if you've sort of broken the game refuses to be broken in that way.
Yeah. Mhm.
It says no, 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 no. She's stronger, no matter what you've attained at this point. And so that's very interesting, and I think we'll segue nicely into our continuing conversations about identity and the changes of identity. Steiner and Beatrix are not where they thought they were. Perhaps Braun is not who we thought she was, and certainly Dagger and Zidane have a lot more to learn about themselves. Vivi is the one who's seemingly on the chopping block right now, who is immediately learning about how he came to be and the function that he was created for Kuja and Braun's malevolent designs, as it were, or to do malfeasance for them. But this is something that the other characters will run into in their own various ways as well. I mean, Freya having to deal with her long lost lover forgetting her, I think, is around on the scale of what
Mhm.
Vivi is going to have to go through. So shocking that it changes how one sees oneself. Um,
Totally.
but I guess we have to get to Clara now, and to this place that's encompassed by a Darudian sandstorm. Um, One wonders if that music, if they played that music, if the sandstorm could have continued on. Um,
I'm sure they had dance parties every night as they were developing this game. Yeah. They're like, all right, we may as well put this in the game. Yeah.
yes, yeah,
Those were the days.
yes. Well, Well, my friend, I think we've done a pretty good job doing what we could do this morning, nice and early, a little earlier
Yeah.
than usual if people notice the light in the background. But I think we were fresh because of the early hour and brought a lot to the table in our cornucopia.
So much here. Yeah. I mean, so we'll pick up with the next story beats, and I think we'll have to go back and scoop up a little bit of what's going on with Steiner and Garnet
Uh,
next time as well, and see how far they can progress. Yeah, so yeah, after that shattering attack from Beatrix and both of them leaving, like not even deigning to finish off the party, right? We're just kind of there. That's disc one, and it stops, and you got to save it and put in disc two, and it picks up with Steiner and Garnet again, and so they've kind of got their their side of the story here to fill in. But yeah, thanks again. Until next time.
Thank you. All right.